The waters of Nova Scotia have a long history of shipwrecks. Every stretch of coastline has a story to tell.
Our story today focuses on the Patrick Morris, a rail ferry vessel that ran between North Sydney, Nova Scotia, and Port aux Basques in Labrador, Newfoundland. She was the first ship of her type to run between North Sydney and Port aux Basques. She would continue this work for 9 years, until the early hours of the 20th of April, 1970.
Originally built in 1951 by the Canadian Vickers in Montreal. From bow to stern, she measured at about 140 meters. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any primary sources on her tonnage, with numbers in the range of 5,000 to 10,000 tons. Rail ferries, or roll-on roll-off vessels, have been around for the better part of 2 centuries, with the earliest examples existing as far back as 1833, on the Monkland and Kirkland Lock railways to traverse the Forth at Clyde Canal. Rail ferries have a deck equipped with a set of tracks used to transport locomotives or rolling stock over bodies of water either too large for bridges to cross over or where no pre-existing infrastructure exists. She was initially named the New Grand Haven and worked the route between Palm Beach in Florida to Havana in Cuba for the West India Fruit Company. However, after relations between the United States and Cuba soured during the Cold War, the USA imposed a trade embargo on Cuba. The company thereafter went out of business and sold all of its assets, with New Grand Haven being bought by the Canadian government and handed over to the Canadian National Railway and renamed to the Patrick Morris. She was put to work on the route between North Sydney, Nova Scotia and the Channel Port aux Basques in 1961. One thing that made the Patrick Morris well equipped, since she initially had to be compatible with the narrow gauge railways of Cuba, was she was equipped with narrow gauge track on her decks. Track gauge refers to the distance between rails, with standard gauge being 4 foot 8 inches and a half across, with narrow gauge referring to anything smaller than that. At the time, Newfoundland and Labrador was a part of the Canadian National Network that operated a narrow gauge railway. They constructed a transfer yard in North Sydney so that any freight on standard gauge rolling stock could be transferred to narrow gauge. For 9 years, she carried rolling stock from the transfer yard in North Sydney to Labrador. From here, we introduce the second ship of our story, the fishing vessel Enterprise, weighing in at 106 tons and measuring 32 meters from bow to stern. She departed Isle aux Morts on the 17th of April in 1970. Over the course of 3 days, the weather would worsen. In the late hours of the 19th, the crew of the Enterprise would issue a mayday call to all local ships when she was caught in a severe storm. Prior to the mayday call, the Patrick Morris was being loaded with freight bound for Labrador. Over the radio, a call from the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax went out
And requested that the Canadian National Railway send out its 2 ferry vessels, the Patrick Morris and the William Carson, to help in rescue efforts. However, the William Carson was still loading passengers and freight that night, so the Patrick Morris went out alone ahead of her scheduled time at 23:45 that night. Not long after, she arrived at the last known location of the Enterprise and joined with other vessels in the area to help in the search for survivors. Unfortunately, she would be struck on her stern loading ramp by a 9.1 meter wave, causing her to rapidly take on water. The captain of the Morris would immediately issue abandon ship order, calling for crew to don life jackets and board life vessels. It only took the Patrick Morris 35 minutes to sink in approximately 90 meter deep water, with the crew being swept up onto the deck of the Morris twice before she finally submerged. With ships already in the area searching for survivors of the Enterprise, it wasn't long before they were picked up, primarily by the fishing vessel Rhine Ore. Out of the 51 crew members of the Patrick Morris, 47 survived, with the only body of the deceased being recovered being that of the captain.
As for the Enterprise, it was considered lost with all hands. The general rule of thumb among mariners is when there's a vessel in distress, any ship able to help shall provide aid, regardless of any personal feelings toward the crew or the company that owns the vessel. It can't be understated the courage it takes to sail out in rough weather, especially those familiar with how unforgiving the North Atlantic can be. The story of the Patrick Morris and her crew, the night of her sinking, is one of bravery and misfortune.